Welcome back.
Thanks. Ready for another episode?
I'm always ready.
Okay, so thanks for joining us. This is I'm Mandy. This is Jared. We're gonna do another episode of As the Walker Turns. What do you want to talk about today?
I want more stories. I'm always fascinated with the stories because they never grow.
Maybe that should be the next book. Stories from the front line. Stories from the. I don't know what we call it.
I don't know about front line.
No, okay, yeah, it's
maybe
frontline.
to work on this title a little bit more.
Okay, that's fair.
So,
All right.
Yeah.
Okay.
So.
Okay, so I'm going to tell a story that happened, I have to look it up, maybe 10 years ago. I had the great honor and privilege of working with truly the world's oldest man, like Guinness Book World Record. His name was Walter Bruning, 114 years old.
Okay.
And Walter lived in a community.
What were his secrets to?
No children. We found out.
Okay, I'm headed in the right direction. Keep going.
He said he was never married.
Okay.
But then
He said that
he was married twice. He was a cigar smoking, whiskey drinking, had eggs and bacon every day. He was awesome. He was an awesome man. He worked for the railroad for many, many years.
Okay.
That's what he told me his secret was. But anyway, Walter was turning 114 years old. Okay. And Guinness Book World Records was coming to handle, do the whole promotion.
And the certificate, because they have to
Yeah.
verify everything.
Correct.
Right? Yeah.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah, they got to make it all. And there's one particular person at the time that did nothing but this. This was his job.
Okay.
To do that. And so when Walter, we knew, because obviously the list gets shorter as time goes, so we knew this was a potential.
Way to take this down. We were really up high, and then we went down low.
I know. But Walter was a local celebrity, and he was in Great Falls, Montana. And Walter lived in a building called the Rainbow, and it was turning 100 years old. And this is a former hotel. And they had turned it into senior living many years before, and so I was there operating the building. And so we were going to have a big party, obviously. And Walter had recently won an Emmy Award. I know.
Wait, what? At 113?
I think so.
Okay,
he won an Emmy Award because he worked on this documentary for, I don't even remember what it was. So I'm at the building, I've got an Emmy, in one hand.
He didn't die.
Holding the Emmy? No.
Before he got to 114.
No. He got to celebrate his birthday. And so we're there, and of course, just chaos getting the building ready. And they're going to do like this 1920s flappers theme because this building actually in the basement had like where all the big electrical panels are. They had this area is all bricked off. And I was like, what is this? And they're like, oh yeah, this is where the citizens of the town used to run liquor underneath the streets of the town. So they had
Prohibition.
during Prohibition, right. So everything was like bricked up. So anyway, we're like getting the building ready. People want to go down there and see it and all that kind of stuff. And the next thing you know, the governor and his security entourage show up at the building. We had invited them, and the governor at the time knew Walter, and they were kind of friends. They would banter back and forth. And so the governor...
No warning.
I don't remember if we had warning. I think it was sketchy, but he shows up in the whole detail. And I was like, okay, go get Walter. And so Walter shows up. The governor shows up. I'm standing there in between him in the lobby. And the governor was wearing a bolo tie. So for those that don't know...
In Montana, I'm shocked.
Shocked. So yes, it was like, I think it was like silver and turquoise, and it had the cord, whatever. And Walter was in a suit. And Walter looked at the governor and he said, you're not wearing that to my party. And so Walter turned around and he went back to his apartment, came back up and gave the governor a tie and said, yeah, you're wearing this to my party. And I'm just standing there going, I'm so sorry. Oh my God.
When you get to be 114, what else do you have to lose?
Nothing. We just rolled with it. The governor complied. I'm like, okay. And you could just see the Secret Service or whatever, the security in the background going, okay.
Did not see that one coming.
Nope, couldn't see that coming. So anyway, Walter had we had to have a full-time employee do nothing but press with him because he was on all sorts of like national news stories.
You had a full-time comms department for him.
And then people would come in off the street. We had to put signs on the street that said Walter was taking visitors.
No, you're kidding. He was like a tourist trap?
Yes. I can't believe I'm saying this. Yes. Yes, he would have visiting hours.
Was there an admission fee?
No.
Okay.
He just would hold court and tell stories. And there's also a very famous artist called Charles Russell. He's a very famous Western artist that was...
Did he sign autographs?
No, Charles is dead.
Okay. No, I'm still going back to Walter. I'm still...
Oh, yeah. Anyway, but Charles and Walter would hang out in the basement while Charles would paint. So people like to come to the building, too, because of that kind of history of it. But, yeah, he'd sign autographs. He'd let me hold his Emmy. I actually have one of his ties at home, and it's so sweet because it had ripped. Walter wasn't a wealthy man. I mean, at 114, but so he relied on his pension money from the railroad. So he actually got pension for, I want to say 40 years longer than he was an actual employee of the railroad. And they...
I mean,
they're a little upside down on that,
right.
But anyway, so Walter had this tie and it had ripped in the back, and so it's hand stitched, not well, but it's with love, and yeah, I got that after he passed. It was very sweet.
So how long did he end up living? How old was he?
He was 114 when he passed away,
okay.
And it was very quick, and I'll never forget, when Walter had to go to the hospital, I was there, I happened to be there, and Walter was very clear on, how he wanted his end to be, so no further treatment, and, the executive director and I were standing in the room, and the executive director literally collapsed, and so I'm trying to pull the executive director out of the room, and then all of a sudden the comms person, I don't know what their title was for the hospital, shows up because he was there under a pseudonym because they were concerned that the press would show up. And so we're all in a ICU room, literally over the bed with laptops writing, as he wanted his obituary, and it was quite a situation.
So
Anywho.
Turning the corner now, back to the guidebook.
You asked.
Yeah, I did, but I always need to remember that I should think these things through to their logical progression.
Okay.
Anyway.
By the way, I didn't prep him. I don't ever tell him what the stories are.
No, I never get any warning, and so I have no idea what's coming next. So, but turning the corner from bolo ties to to the guidebook and staffing at communities.
Yes.
I mean, you just touched on, relative to your story with Walter, about his own press secretary and the connection, obviously, that the executive director had with him as well, and so forth.
Yeah.
But obviously, those staff are the ones that the residents deal with on a daily basis. And I've heard you talk before about you can have the greatest community with all of the amenities, but it's really the staff and the residents that make up the heart and soul of what becomes essentially a family. So how is that staff important from not only the standpoint of the sense of community, but also then the care that they receive on the medical side? And I mean, because I'm assuming that there are levels of care and levels of staff experience and so forth that all relate to it. So.
Yeah, it's going to be very different. So this is one thing that is going to be, if this is a must-have for you and your family in terms of maybe around-the-clock nursing care. When I say nursing, I mean actual, licensed nurses. Or are you okay with, professional caregivers? And if you're looking at the different levels of care, your skilled nursing requirements are generally federally regulated, right? So you have to have so many nurses on the floor, so many CNAs on the floor, so many whatever. It's very, very structured. Assisted living, some states do have staffing requirements or ratios, but most don't. So most of the regulations read that, do you have enough staff that's adequate to provide the care for the residents here? Which is ambiguous, right? Define adequate.
Right.
And that's going to come down to smart people at the community saying, based on maybe not so much a number of the residents, I'm not going to make up a number, but, it's more about what we call acuity. More is how intense of care do these residents need. So, maybe you have 8 residents that require 1 caregiver, but the next 8 residents require 2 caregivers, right? It just depends on their needs at the time, and that fluctuates. So I would say, if I'm looking at staffing, I'm going to go in and ask the communities, how long is your director? Whether they call it a director of nursing, a health and wellness director, an assisted living director, there's all different kinds of titles. Okay, what does that look like? How long have they been here, and how long have they been in the business? If they're a brand new nurse coming in right out of school to run an entire community with all of the CNAs and caregivers, to me that would be a big thing. Maybe they're a superstar and they can handle it, but really in assisted living, nurses don't act as nurses. They act, their primary responsibility is to handle the staff and all the staffing needs, right? So from hiring to disciplinary action, reviews, all that kind of stuff that you need to have a good workforce. And so you're looking at their leadership, capabilities, and what does that mean in terms of turnover, and what does that mean in terms of, stability. The stability of the actual caregivers is incredibly important, and that comes back to the leadership. So I'd be looking at that. I'd be looking at the longevity of the executive director as well. That person sets the tone for the building. And do you have an opportunity in the tour to meet that person, or learn a little bit about them? Because if you don't have good leadership at the top, all of it it completely affects the entire community.
So you've talked a lot there about the RNs, basically the overall care side of it. What about the activities? What about?
Yeah, there's at any community, I would generally say there's 7 departments. There could be more, there could be less, depending on the size, but you're gonna have an activities department. They have different words for them, but those are the staff that are keeping the residents engaged during the day, whether it's in big group activities, one-on-one activities, and they are truly, if I ever wanna know what's going on in the building, like rumor mill, I go straight to activities. They know everything. Okay,
everything and then some.
Oh yeah, they're drama central. Okay, let's tell me what's the rumor, or what's the word on the street. Then you're gonna have your whole housekeeping and maintenance department, right? So they're the ones doing a lot of heavy lifting as far as keeping the buildings. The residents are very hard on communities. Those little walkers and wheelchairs and jazzies are whoo. So they are critically important to the success of the community. Then you have dining staff. Now, depending on your community, you may have dedicated dining staff that do nothing but dining. Some communities will have the caregivers, when the residents are dining, they put on the aprons and they serve the food. So, you got to look at, do they have a universal worker kind of setup, or do they really have separate departments? Specialized departments. Then you're going to have obviously your care staff. You're going to have your administrative staff that handles the billing, the HR issues, just any kind of business stuff that comes up. Am I missing anyone? I think that's all of them. Could be missing something.
What about training, licensing? What about that side of, in terms of especially ongoing training for staff? How important should that be? Something that prospective residents are looking at as something that is important when evaluating a community?
Yeah, you can certainly ask. The training is going to come down to the state regulations, and is also going to come down to what the community insists on top of that. So when you're talking about training, it could be something that is federally regulated, state regulated, maybe it's health department for the kitchen related, maybe it's it's training is never, you have to have so much to start, then you have to have so much ongoing throughout the year, and then you're going to have training needs based on situations happening in the building, whether it's an instant thing, or it's we're going to have a weekly meeting or a monthly all staff meeting. So training never ends. And even for the management staff as well, if you're holding a license, you have to have so many hours per year to keep that going. And it's going to be much more intense on the skilled nursing side than it would be in assisted living, but by no means, we were just looking at training logs yesterday, and we're talking hundreds of hours. And the hard part is that most states, let's just say you're hiring a caregiver or a CNA that has 10 years of experience working for other big operations, generally those training requirements that they've done aren't transferable, which I wish they would change, because some things you just know. You've been in the business a long time, and we should be able to accept that, but we have a ways to go there.
What about, you mentioned when we started this section about staffing, basically how long like the executive director had been with the community. And you've touched on this a little bit before, but turnover.
Yeah.
How important is that? Is there a particular percentage that you think that folks should look at from the standpoint of it being a cause for concern?
Yeah, the industry, here's the dichotomy here is that if you look at the survey results for senior living, we are like over 90% satisfaction, which is higher than hotels, Nike, love Nike, it's unbelievable how happy the residents are. And one of the biggest reasons that staff work in communities is because of the residents, right? And one of the number one reasons they leave is because of the residents. So when you're looking at turnover, it would be more of an ask of what's happening, maybe versus the percentage. And percentages can be skewed based on, do you have 200 staff or do you have 2 staff, right? So you can ask, I don't want to put a number out there just because I think those percentages might be a little bit weird, but I would ask for, okay, how long necessarily has your leadership team been there? And then people that maybe handle the medications, like have they been there for 1 week or have they been there for several years? Usually that's kind of like your mid-level management position in terms of the care department. I think it's also very important to ask the question, I don't think I even cover this in the guidebook, but what is, if the residents are bullying, and I'm not saying any of your family members would be like that, but if that's the situation or the family members are bullying staff, how does the staff handle that? Like how do is the community going to allow that to happen? Because mean girls, it's a real thing, right? So we want to make sure at our communities we are protecting not only our residents from that kind of behavior, but also our staff, because our staff are precious. We can't do this business without them. So we have to protect them too.
Yeah. So you mentioned, I think it was in our last episode, that when we were going through must-haves versus wants, that one of the things for your mom that you had was safety. And that turns the corner into the next chapter, but what things should family members be on the lookout for as it relates to the safety side of things? What should be red flags and causes for concern, or even just understanding what state regulations, mandates, etc. are already in place that they shouldn't need to worry about as much.
Yeah, and I'm not going to say I don't know every regulation for every state, but I will say that generally speaking, if you're in a larger community, your staff have to be awake. When I speak specifically about assisted living and memory support, they need to be awake staff 24/7, okay? Some of the smaller communities, there are state regulations where the staff can sleep when the residents sleep, and then they have call buttons and things like that they can push, but our staff are required to be awake because things happen during the middle of the night, especially in memory support. So I would ask that, do you have awake staff at night? And if so, how many do you have? And again, the numbers could be different just depending on how size of the community, how hard of care are the residents, those kind of things. But you should have more than one for sure handling the residents, because what happens if that person is tied up or needs a break or calls off or whatever the deal is. So looking at your night staff, I would look at the external security of the building. Do they have doors that automatically lock at certain times of night? If not, then what is their process to lock the exterior? What is the process in terms of if a resident is in memory support and they have, windows? Are there alarms on the windows? What kind of, most communities have, we call them nurse call systems, which is kind of an antiquated term, but what in the apartments or what can the residents wear as far as a wearable if something were to happen? I would also look at the maintenance of the building. If you see things like, let's just say, I was walking here a few minutes ago and staff were mopping the floors and it's tile. Did they put the wet signs out? The wet signs out on the floor so that not only I'm not slipping, but residents aren't slipping. Those are kind of like small things to look at, but it could mean a bigger pattern. Do you have big potholes in the, driveway when you're walking up? I think you just tell pretty quickly if the building's being kept up and maintained, and that would indicate maybe some security safety issues.
What about, I saw this reference in the guidebook and would have been something I would have never thought of.
What did I say?
But, evacuation, relocation.
Yes, yes.
Once you mentioned it, I was like, okay, that probably happens more often than you might think.
You want to talk about sleepless nights? It's probably the executive director's two things that are going to bring them to their knees: a missing resident and evacuating a building. I mean, it is horrific when it happens. I've been very lucky. I've had a building evacuate into my community before because of a wildfire. But if you're in areas where you have tornado risks or hurricane risks, things like that, that's just much more of a reality. That being said, floods can happen, fires can happen. So I would ask the community a couple things. Not that you need to get into the weeds on their entire disaster plan, because depending on the disaster, you have a different plan. But I would ask the question, do you guys have a disaster plan? And how often are you reviewing it? Because if there's turnover in the staff, they need to know at a minimum who to call, because someone's going to know what to do.
Right.
And if my mom, for some reason, her apartment flooded or something happened, where are you going to move her to? Or is this going to be a community down the street? Is this going to be a hotel? Do I have to take mom home? So when that community was evacuating, there was a wildfire. It was shocking how many families did not pick up their loved ones, and we were transporting them 30 miles away. So it was super inconvenient for the families to go get their loved ones, but that may not be the reality of what the disaster looks like. So what do they shelter in place? Most will shelter in place if they can, if it's safe. If not, then they will have to evacuate.
I'm sure that also relates to generators, emergency food and water supplies, call systems.
All of that.
Again, those are just things that they need to double check.
Yeah, and it's not usually unless you're in skilled nursing, to have a generator on site. So if you ask them, what if your power goes out, which happens,
right?
Sure. What do you do, and how long is that going to keep up? Because if for me, my mom isn't on oxygen, right? So, but if my mom was on an oxygen concentrator and we had limited power or no power and it was plugged into the wall, that's going to be a concern. So do you have backup tanks that'll last a little bit of time? Most communities will have backup, I hope, they have backup water and food supplies, but it's not going to be forever. It might be a few days, and, it's like camping, okay? Because we won't have gas, you wouldn't have water, you're going to be grilling everything out of the fridges,
right.
To deplete the resources. And again, in the scheme of what does that natural disaster look like, I'm probably a little bit biased. My husband is a firefighter and a paramedic, and so when they're looking at disaster planning, where are they going to go first? I'm not sure senior living is going to be the first if it is a massive disaster. They may have other priorities. I don't know. You may want to ask the question.
What about, again, something I would have never even thought to ask, but what about fire drills, disaster drills?
Right. Yeah.
Active shooter, all of those.
Those are all the things we have to do. And it is, again, state regulated, but typically you're doing fire drills every month. You would rotate in terms of AM, PM, your overnight shift. So they understand different types of fires. I've had dryer fires versus a vent in the ceiling caught on fire once. I had a resident that decided to cook shrimp and grits at 2:30 in the morning and burn the kitchen down, which the fire went out very quickly, but it's flooded 5 floors of apartments, right? That was the bigger issue, was the water damage. So all of those things can happen. Active shooter, or we call them probably armed intruder at this point. I think schools are kind of calling it that way as well. It's the reality of any business that you're in. Those are things that communities should be drilling for, as well as, depending on your area, tornadoes, hurricanes, earthquakes, all those kind of things, wildfire. Yeah.
Awesome. Well,
is it? I
mean, again, it is not awesome, but it's good for people to be thinking about those things, because again, that's probably not what they think of when they walk into a community for the first time.
No.
They're probably much more concerned about, is the food okay? Are the people nice? And not
Mom, gonna get my meds.
Yes.
Right. Yes. Right.
And not that those aren't.
They're all important.
They're important, but again, it goes to the overall level of care that your family member is then going to receive.
Yeah, and one thing I forgot to mention too is, heaven forbid that were to happen at a community. what does the communication system look like? That to me is probably the most important question to ask. You know, maybe assumptive close that they know what to do in a fire, but if it was going to happen, how are you going to tell me?
Right.
And they should have some kind of mass communication system out there, whether it's, you know, you pay for these things, but I can't tell you, it doesn't have to be just bad things, right? I could be announcing great things or
Right.
come to our event or whatever, but how are you going to communicate with me? Because there's no way in a disaster for someone to be sitting on the phone calling 100 people or emailing individually 100 people. It's just not possible. And when that happens, families panic. So for us to be able to do that even off-site, so let's just say we have no internet, or we wouldn't have internet,
Right.
someone else can then type the message, and the team, the management team, is able to care for the residents and not worry about all the incoming phone calls.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Good deal.
Nice.
Well, another wonderful episode in the books.
Thank you.
And I guess next time, let's look.
What are we doing?
We are talking about level of care and care fees, who does what
Yeah.
in terms of inside of the community, technology for residents and families, which you just kind of talked about there a little bit. So we still have a lot to
We're getting into the weeds.
unpack.
Yeah, we are getting in the weeds. Okay,
So,
great.
But great to be here.
Thanks.
As always,
Thanks.
I'm sure everyone learned a lot and will continue to do so.
Thanks,
So,
everybody.
yep. Goodbye.
Bye.